I thought I'd start the sermon homily this morning with words by Khalil Gibran. And Khalil says, "When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for what has been your delight." MAiD is complex and deeply personal. I expect everyone here knows someone that has chosen MAiD. Last year, at least 3 of our members chose MAiD deaths. This morning, I'm going to start with a few statistics about MAiD, just so we're sort of all in the same place. I'm going to talk about our principles and how our principles support, I think, MAiD, a little history of MAiD, and then I'll talk about the current legislation and the proposed changes in legislation that were going to happen for next year. And finally, I'll give you a couple of very small vignettes from my experience that I'm happy to talk about more during the forum time, which happens after the service. This year marks the 7th year of access to MAiD in Canada. The 3rd federal report on medical assistance in dying, MAiD, data shows that 10,000 people accessed MAiD in 2021. It's the most recent statistic available. And in all, 30,000 Canadians have chosen MAiD. Just to give you a rough idea of what that looks like, 3.3% of all deaths in Canada last year were MAiD deaths. On a provincial level, we have the most MAiD deaths, and on Vancouver Island, we have a particularly high number of MAiD deaths. Now, advocates say it isn't surprising that our numbers are going up, and this isn't really something to be alarmed by. As people talk more and more about MAiD, as people know more and more people that choose MAiD, it becomes more accessible, more people have the information. And in Europe, where procedures like MAiD have been available for many years, they found that the leveling off point was about 5% of all deaths. It's about equal between men and women, 52% men and about 47-48% of women. So more men than women, but only just. And the average age was about 76. Of all of the applications, written applications for MAiD, 81% were approved in 2021. And the most common conditions that people access it for are cancer, cardiovascular conditions, respiratory conditions, and neurological conditions. And as of March last year, in 2021, people who requested MAiD needed to satisfy the following criteria. And I'm sorry this is a little dry, but I think it's really important that we just all really understand. You have to be 18 or older, and that's possibly changing in the future. You have to be eligible for publicly funded healthcare. So that means there's no MAiD traveling, so people couldn't come here unless they had access to the Canadian medical system. You have to make a voluntary request that cannot be seen as pressure being put on you to make that request by a family member or whoever. You have to give informed consent to MAiD, and we can talk about that more on the forum, what that really means. And you have to have a serious and incurable illness, disease, or disability, excluding a mental illness, and I'll come to that, or be in an advanced stage of irreversible decline in your capabilities. You have to have enduring and intolerable physical or psychological suffering that cannot be alleviated under conditions that the person considers acceptable, and 2 healthcare professionals have to approve. So let's circle to our principles. What are our principles? How do they inform MAiD? Well, our very first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. It's interesting to contemplate that in relation to accessing a MAiD procedure. These principles were written to uphold life, but I think they work equally well when thinking about the right for people to die. Equally, MAiD speaks to the start of our second principle, justice, equity, and compassion, especially compassion. I've worked in the field of helping people around death doesn't quite sound right, but I've been a type of death doula where people have invited me to be with them in the last weeks, days, and sometimes just hours. And I've seen some really difficult things. It's been hard work. And I think that MAiD can be quite a compassionate gift for those who choose it. Our 7th principle speaks of respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. And if respect means we acknowledge when it's time for a part of the web to let go and die, then I think this principle informs MAiD as well. And turning to our sources, which some of you know are my favorite, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. There is direct experience and mystery of wonder to be present when someone dies. Our first source speaks of upholding life, and those sentiments are true in death as well. Spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. I don't think that MAiD is really interfering in the circle of life. It's allowing the circle of life to turn a little bit faster while avoiding suffering. Let's move to the history of MAiD. 30 years ago, this name may be familiar to many people in British Columbia. Sue Rodriguez wanted to end her life. She had ALS. And she said, "If I cannot give consent to my own death, whose body is this?" Sadly, she was not approved, and she died a painful death of ALS. However, her pioneering work led to changes in legislation. In 2015, the Kay Carter decision, she fought to have a doctor help her die in BC. And the ban on medical assistance in death was seen as contravening the Canadian Charter of Rights, and Kay won, and her doctor was allowed to help her die. When the MAiD law first came into effect, it stated that someone accessing MAiD had to have a medical condition such that they had a reasonably and foreseeable death. But you can hear how that's changed in the intervening years. Now the wording says, a condition which is grievous and irremediable, i.e. you've taken steps to try and be out of pain, etc., and those steps have not worked adequately for you. Someone in an advanced state, I just said that, sorry. The vast majority of Canadians support MAiD, but there are a lot of ethical issues. No doubt we're going to be talking about those. Now, on March 17th of this year, MAiD was going to be extended to a whole different group of people, to younger people, so 16 and older, not just 18 and older. It was also going to be expanded to people that solely have a mental health condition. There was a committee looking at this, and they basically said to the government, we do not have enough time. I understand this is very divisive in doctors. There are many doctors who are very for this and many doctors who are against it. So the committee has been given an extra year. So if you solely have a mental health condition, you will not be able to access MAiD for another year. So that will happen in March 2024. The difficulty is when dealing with a mental illness. I'm not a mental illness professional, but we don't really know if a particular mental illness is going to improve or not. Will it improve next year, in 5 years, in 10 years? How long is it to wait for, if you have a mental health condition, to improve? So lots of things to discuss there. You know, some of the mental health advocates say, if you have a mental health issue, it doesn't mean that you don't have decision-making abilities. So I think we really have to be careful of the slippery slope here. And you may have seen some really negative press around MAiD. I certainly have. The Canadian press has been citing people who have been living in poverty and accessed MAiD for the sole reason that they weren't able to afford rent. Now, as I understand that, that's not exactly legal. And 14 MAiD deaths have been investigated, and no wrongdoing was found by any Canadian doctors. So I invite you, when you read those really inflammatory or see them on the television, know that at this point in time, you cannot access MAiD for the sole reason being poverty or a mental health issue. Also, the UN was looking into that, and there was no wrongdoing found. There's a lot of concern from the disabled community who oppose the extension of MAiD, not all, but many, to people who are not going to have a reasonably foreseeable death. You can see why the committee said, we need another year to figure out how we actually legislate this. I'm going to invite you to think about some questions we can talk about in the forum. Is a MAiD death a form of health care? And that's been a big thing in the media recently. Really, is this part of our health care? Well, is it? I think it's part of my health care. If I had 5th stage cancer, I would want to access a MAiD death as part of my health care. Would you choose a MAiD death? Would you support a loved one who wanted to access a MAiD death? In a year's time, Canada, people who live in Canada, who have health care in Canada, will have the most access to MAiD of anyone in the world. I've worked with a number of people who have chosen MAiD, and I've been so moved by their quiet, peaceful, elegant deaths. There are difficulties, though. With every MAiD death that I have been involved in, there has been a person who has been pivotal in the person who's chosen MAiD's death, who has actively encouraged them not to. And that can really strain relations. So while I'm trying to couch this as something that I'm fully supportive of, it is not necessarily an easy decision. There are a lot of people that still have huge trouble with MAiD. My mom, for example, bless her heart, she's 87, she is going downhill very quickly, but because she was brought up in the Anglican Church, she feels it is a suicide to access a MAiD death. And I've worked with a number of people who are Roman Catholic who feel that they won't go to heaven if they access a MAiD death, which is heartbreaking to me. I had a family who invited me to talk their mother out of a MAiD death, which is not my job, but that even I was asked that question. This is for one of my congregants on Salt Spring Island, to be transparent. And that was a very hard situation to be put in. The ethics are difficult and troubling, but once people are no longer fearful of how they might die, they can focus intently on living and allowing themselves to more fully embrace the life they are leaving. I imagine some of you will have beautiful stories about death. In the movie that a group of us watched on Thursday night, and I highly recommend it, it's called Her Last Project. It was filmed in the second year that MAiD was available to people. The woman who's at the center of the movie, her name is Shelley, Dr. Shelley. She was a doctor and had an incurable condition that was taking her downhill very quickly. And she allowed the CBC documentary crew to follow her journey as she talked to professionals around MAiD. And it's an absolutely beautiful film because she is so honest with the whole procedure. And for me, the most amazing piece of it, and I didn't know this, is if you access a MAiD death, you can still have organ transplants so that you can help other people's lives. And the very last scene of the film, you see Shelley go into the room and her husband's in there and the nurse and doctor are in there, and then you see the curtain drawn across. And the camera shifts to looking at the heart monitor, and you can see Shelley's heart rate, and then it just goes flat. At this point, even though I've seen the movie many times, I weep. But then you see the transplant team run in, and they're pushing that gurney out and running down the hall with it to get her into an operating theater in order to be able to save her vital organs, retina, etc. She went on to save 3 other people's lives. And that, to me, was just the most beautiful moment of the movie. And the very last slide said, Dr. Shelley died a spectacular death. And those are the words she wanted to be used around her death. I think I can safely say there wasn't a dry eye in the house when we watched that together on Zoom. I wonder if you recall the last picture of Marilyn Kahn, a beloved member of our congregation. She'd gone up to the Malahat Skywalk, and bless her heart, I've been up many times and I've never had the courage to go down the slide, But dear Marilyn, on the last day that she was alive, chose to come down the slide. And the picture is Marilyn at the bottom of the slide with the biggest grin you can imagine and jazz hands. And I will forever remember that picture. But it's hard because you can see her so full of life. And that is another big issue with MAiD is, as it said in the movie, lots of people said to Dr. Shelley, but you look fine. Doesn't look like there's anything wrong. You look really healthy. So again, you know, if we're talking to people around MAiD, and I'm sorry, I feel like I've moved into like a lecturing mode. I have taught other lay chaplains across Canada about what it's like to be with people that are accessing MAiD. But just be mindful of what you're saying. And, you know, another really poignant moment in the movie was Dr. Shelley said, no one has asked me if I'm scared, and no one has asked me if I'm happy. Pretty poignant. Assisted dying is not so much about dying, it's about how people want to live their life. It's about what's important to them and what brings meaning to their life, what brings joy, what they have lost and what they still have. And to give people the choice at the end of their life to say, it's time, I think is an incredible gift. I really look forward to unpacking this more in the forum. Questions, concerns, please gather with us. At the end of the service, we'll have about 10-15 minutes. You can run across the street and grab some coffee, come back, and we'll share some time in the forum talking about MAiD. I'm going to end with two things. A quotation from Dr. Shelley from her last project. And she says, do what you love with the people you love. I encourage all of you to do so until it is our time. And our very last quotation from a person who had very strong links to the Unitarian community, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Nothing is ever wholly lost. That which is excellent remains forever a part of the universe. I'm going to invite everyone to sing Blue Boat Home, which I thought was the perfect song for after this. So I will invite you to stand in body or in spirit and join us in song and allow me to segue and do a few things behind the computer. I feel like the, you know, the Wizard of Oz who is behind the big green curtain. No, not quite.